This is lesson 8 for chapter 8. It starts out with what the book refers to as the structure, and it gives you the conjugation of the indicative, that's the mood, future, that's the tense, active, that's the voice. So far in this class, you've done exclusively the active voice, which means the subject is the doer of the action. And you've mostly done the indicative mood, but you've also done the imperative mood, which is used for commands. And you've done the infinitive mood, which is when you take a verb and turn it into a noun. So the indicative mood is an assertion about reality. The indicative mood asserts something about reality. It can be an opinion, it can be a lie, but you're making an assertion about reality, which distinguishes it from the other major mood that people use in everyday speech, which is the subjunctive, which is about potentiality. So the indicative is about reality. The future obviously is set in the future time, and the active voice means the subject is doing the action. Just so you understand all the details of the indicative, future, active. Right now you're going to learn the conjugation of the indicative, future, active for the first and second conjugation verbs only. You will not learn it for the third I verbs, or the fourth conjugation. This is the system that only works for the first and second conjugation. In order to do that, you take the second principal part of whatever verb you're dealing with. Let's say it's amo, amare. There's your second principal part. Let me make that a little bigger for you. You're going to take the second principal part of whatever verb you're dealing with. As usual, whether it's a first or a second conjugation verb, you're going to drop the RE from the second principal part. Then you're left with the verbal theme, ama or mone. To this theme, you're going to add the sign of the future, which really is something like BI, although you'll notice down here in step 3 that it's not BI for the first person singular, and it's not BI for the third person plural. So I think it's more effective to say that what you do to the theme, which is the stem minus the RE, is not add, as the book describes it, BI plus additional endings. I think that's too complicated of a way to describe it. I think it's much simpler to say take the second principal part, drop the RE from a first conjugation verb, or drop the RE from a second conjugation verb. This is for third conjugation, third I, and fourth, so we ignore them for today. And after you drop the RE from ama, or the RE from mona, then you add bo, bis, bit, bimus, bitis, and bunt. I think it's a very straightforward way to describe it, contrary to the way the book describes it. So you can take any second conjugation or first conjugation verb. You can take the second principal part of optare. You would drop the RE, and then you would add bo. And then you would add bis, bit, bimus, bitis, and bunt. And that is the conjugation of the indicative, future, active. You translate it as you might expect. Opto means wish, so optabo would mean I will wish, or I shall wish. Optabis, you will wish. Optabit, he, she, or it will wish. Optabimus, we will wish. Optabitus, you all will wish. And optabunt, they will wish. Show you one more time with another verb, one from the second conjugation if you have the verb docere, there's the second principal part. You drop the re from the second principal part, and then you add the sign, the endings of the future, the suffixes for the future, which is bo, bis, bit. You add that to the theme, and now you have the indicative future active. The translation would be I will teach, or I shall teach. You will teach, etc. He, she, or it will teach. We will teach. You all will teach. They will teach. The crucial thing you have to remember is that this is only so far for first and second conjugation, I should say. This is only for first and second conjugation verbs. You do not know how to conjugate the third, third eye, or fourth conjugation verbs yet. So this is only for the first two kinds of verbs, the first and second conjugation. And that's mostly what we've been working with in this class anyway. So that's not really a surprise to you. It's just a drastic difference when you learn the future in the other conjugations. So I want to point that out so you're prepared for it. The future is different in the third, third eye, and fourth conjugations. But number 2 in chapter 8 is that two adjectives that modify a single noun, you don't always need to translate the Latin word et. It's a very small point, but the book gives the example in silva densa et umbrosa, which says in a forest, silva, dense and shady. She suggests, the author of the text suggests that you can translate this as in a dense, shady forest. You don't necessarily have to translate it as in a dense and shady forest. Really, though, that's up to you. This is not a rule that you need to really memorize. It may sound better when you translate it at times, but don't go crazy trying to memorize this rule. It's not crucial to your translation or understanding of Latin. It's a good suggestion, but it's not something to memorize. Point 3 is another relatively minor point, but it's crucial to your understanding. Latin combines the word tecum, or the words, I should say, te and cum, really in reverse order to what your brain is used to. You would expect to read, because of the way it's translated, to see cum and te, cum being a preposition, te being the object of that preposition in the ablative. You would expect the word order to be cum te, but in Latin they generally write it in reverse word order, te cum, and they tend to put the words written as if it were one word. So te cum with no space, me cum with no space, vobis cum with no space, and nobis cum with no space between the preposition and the object of the preposition in the ablative. However, you translate it as you would expect it to be translated. So when you see te cum, it means with you. That's not the word order Latin puts it in. Latin puts it in the reverse order. It says you with. Or me cum would be me with. But obviously that doesn't sound good in English translation. So you reverse the word order that the Latin puts the words in, and you translate the cum first. So te cum means with you. Me cum means with me. Vobis cum or vobis cum means with you all, plural. And nobis cum means with us. And you just reverse the Latin word order when you translate it into English. And you have to be aware that Latin writes them as one word, even though they are really two different words. The fourth point is giving you the second declension nouns, a review of the forms that you've already done, and showing you some new forms that you haven't really seen before. You've seen them in the screencasts that I've done, but I want to make sure that you understand the different subcategories. You've learned the first declension. That's very easy. There's only one variety of that. Puella, puellae. That's how it would look in the dictionary. You'd have the nominative singular in the dictionary, and you'd have the genitive singular in the dictionary, often abbreviated so that all you would see for the genitive is the AE. First declension is pretty simple. You should have that down. The second declension has a number of different varieties. There is the simplest variety of second declension, amicus. That's a good paradigm for the second declension. To find the stem of amicus, you take the genitive, which is the second thing in the dictionary, and you drop off the I, and now you've got the stem for that noun. So it's amic all the way through, and everything that comes after the C is the ending. That's how you know what your endings are, and you can memorize the endings individually, which will make it a little bit easier to learn these patterns. And note that I've included the vocative in this pattern. It goes nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and vocative. And then the plural, same pattern, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and then vocative. So the simplest and most common form of second declension follows the paradigm or the model of amicus. There is, however, the second subcategory of the second declension that are like puer. The main difference with puer and amicus is that puer does not end in us in the nominative singular. Otherwise, you find the stem in the same way. You take the genitive form, drop the I from it, and now you have the basic form, to which you add the exact same endings as you added to amicus. So it's a very minor difference. The plural is no different than amicus as well. You're adding the same endings. It just has a difference in the nominative singular. No other difference whatsoever. Now, if I were teaching the class live, I would ask you, what is the problem, or what's the difference between puer and ager? Because puer and ager both are spelled the same. They're missing the us in the nominative singular. And you would assume, therefore, that these are redundant forms and they're exactly the same. But what happens with ager is that after the nominative, it loses the E, so that the stem becomes agri in all of the other singular and plural forms. So the nominative is alone in having an E in the theme. That's why you always go to the genitive to find the theme. You take the genitive form, you drop the I, and then you have the theme for the rest of the word. You'll note that it never has an ager except in the nominative. Otherwise, the endings in the singular and the plural, which I haven't written down, but the endings in the singular and plural are exactly the same for ager and puer. The only difference with ager and between ager and puer is that ager has the E in the nominative singular, but nowhere else. Whereas you can see that this theme for puer continues the entire time with the E. So there's the forms of the noun agri in the plural forms. Again, you'll note that it loses the E, but the endings are exactly the same as they are for amicus. Finally, there is the highly irregular noun vir or weir. I pronounce the V sometimes because I was used to teaching ecclesiastical Latin for a while, in which you pronounce the V as a V, but classical Latin pronunciation generally requires you to pronounce the V as a W. So here's the word weir. it is the same endings as puer and ager. The difference is from amicus is that it does not have the us on the nominative singular. And then you can see that the difference is that it has an IR instead of an ER or a dropped E. So it's very much like puer except with IR instead of an ER. Naturally, the nominative forms are going to be exactly the same as amicus. So a few minor variations that you do need to practice that I will test you on, but otherwise, these are not complicated forms. It's just a matter of sitting down and taking the time to memorize them. Puer, ager, and wir are slight deviants from the pattern of amicus, but very minor in the end. Just make sure to understand the difference, especially between these two and the first two varieties, because these first two varieties are a little more common than the other two. The next point is essentially nothing new. I've told you before about the regular old kind of 2-1-2 adjectives that follow a pattern that look like this in the dictionary: bonus for the masculine, bona for the feminine, and bonum for the neuter. Since adjectives have to agree with the nouns they modify in case, number, and gender, you have to have all three genders represented for each and every adjective. So here's a regular, standard, most basic variety of adjective, which I call a 2-1-2 adjective because it's a second declension masculine, a first declension feminine pattern, and a second declension neuter pattern. In other words, this follows the pattern that you just saw of amicus. It's an adjective, but it declines exactly like amicus. Bona follows the exact same pattern as puella. And then finally, bonum follows the pattern of a second declension neuter, which you did not see in the previous screen. Templum is the model that the book has used so far. So that's three different patterns, but they just follow the patterns of nouns that you have already learned in previous lessons. It's nothing new for an adjective as far as the declension goes. Now the book teaches you a new kind of subcategory of 2-1-2 adjectives, which follow the pattern of miser, misera, and miserum. This is not a greatly drastic change, however, in the pattern, because miser follows the same exact pattern as puer, which you just saw on the last screen. So it goes miser, miseri. Sorry, I had to edit that there. Misero, miserum, and misero, and then the vocative. That's the singular. Follows the exact same pattern as puer, which you just learned. Puella is the model for misera. Nothing new there at all. Miseri. And the same thing is true for miserum. That's going to follow the exact same pattern as templum, which isn't something that you've seen this lesson, but which you've seen in previous lessons. Miserum, misero, miseri, oh, and the vocative. And note a minor point that the vocative for the neuter is just like the nominative, just like it is for the first declension. It's the second declension that has the funny vocative. And in fact, it's only the second declension nouns that have an us ending that have the E in the vocative. So note that point. So sorry, just note that point, that the vocative for the second declension has an E only for words like amicus. For a word like amicus, which miser is not, the vocative would be an E, but for all of these other vocatives are just like their nominative forms. Now again, if I were teaching the class in person, point number 6 would be one that I would ask you to figure out. If miser, misera, and miserum, if that follows the pattern of puer, puella, and templum, then what pattern do you think that pulcher, pulchra, and pulchrum follow? It's obviously right below here on the screen. It follows the pattern of ager, which drops the E, puella, which we've just seen, and templum. So it's only the second declension masculine form that is somewhat different than the pattern that you just saw above with miser, misera, and miserum. I won't bore you by writing out pulchra, the feminine form, and pulchrum, the neuter form, but just so you see for a second what ager pattern, the ager pattern looks like for pulcher. Starts out in the nominative pulcher, and then it drops the E and follows that pattern for the rest of the declension. Pulchro, pulcher. Note again that the nominative and vocative are exactly the same, so the E comes back, but then for the plural, you go back to the pattern of the E having disappeared, because that's really the norm for this kind of noun. No E. And I ran out of room for the vocative, but it's going to be exactly the same as the nominative form in the plural with no E. The seventh point that the book presents is the future tense of sum. This is just something you have to memorize. This would be the indicative, future, active. The same thing that you learned at point number 1 of this chapter. The indicative present active, you should have already memorized. The indicative imperfect active, you also should have memorized by now. And now you're learning today the indicative future active. Again, these are forms that are irregular and need to be memorized. Ero means I will or I shall. Eris is you will. Erit is he, she, or it will. Erimus, we will or we shall. Eritis, you all will. And finally, erunt, they will. You can say shall, obviously, if that's how you speak. I don't think a lot of people use it today. It is technically the proper form for I and we in the indicative future active, but I won't ever penalize anyone for using will instead. I will, you will, he, she, or it will, we will, you will, and they will. Ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritis, erunt. Distinguish these three forms and memorize them, because obviously the verb to be is used all the time in almost every other sentence that you'll read in this book. You'll have to contend with a form of the verb to be. You've got to memorize these. You've got to get flashcards for these. These have to be mastered because they are irregular, and it's more difficult to recognize them as opposed to the more obvious forms that are regular. One last point about word order. The book points out to you that adjective of size and quantity and number, anything that describes the size of something, the quantity of something, or the number, generally come before the noun that they modify. So look at the example in the book. It says, Regina in magna regia habitat. The queen lives, here's your prepositional phrase, in a great palace. Note that the noun is preceded by the adjective of size. Since it's an adjective of size, it comes before the noun that it modifies. Unlike the normal word order in English, these adjectives tend to come before the nouns that they modify. The book gives another example on page 64. It says, Quinque equos in campo videbat. He saw 5 horses on the plain. Since it is the number 5, quinque, it comes before the noun that it modifies, horses, on the plain, videbat. He saw 5 horses on the plain. The adjective of quantity comes before the noun that it modifies, whereas most other adjectives tend to come after the nouns they modify. This again is another rule that you should not worry about memorizing, because you will not be writing letters in Latin to anyone. You really don't need to compose or speak Latin. You may want to get into it, and there are people that do this. The University of Kentucky has a summer program every year for people that want to speak Latin. And there are programs in Rome for people that want to speak Latin. But for the most part, you're not going to be speaking any Latin or writing letters in Latin to your friends. So this is something that you may want to be aware of, because it will help you when you get to more complex sentences. If you're wondering what adjective goes with what noun, because it can get confusing, remember that size, quantity, and number generally come before the nouns they modify. But I want to stress the point, generally, that's not always the case, especially in poetry. Latin word order is very flexible. That's why I say these rules are not that crucial to your understanding. And that's it. This is me saying bye. You Skype me at Sean E. Lake if you have questions about this or any of the other previous lessons that we've done.